Hello, and welcome to Horns of a Dilemma, the podcast of the Texas National Security Review, TNSR. I'm Doyle Hodges, Executive Editor of TNSR. If you have an interest in maritime strategy, you've doubtless heard of the two great giants of strategic thought from the end of the 19th century, Alfred Thayer Mahan and Sir Julian Corbett. In this week's episode of Horns, Professor Kevin McCranie of the United States Naval War College talks about the writings of Mahan and Corbett and how they relate to the contemporary world. Some tend to pose Mahan and Corbett as being opposed to one another, setting up a dynamic where one is either Mahanian or Corbettian, as if one supported the Sharks or the Jets. But as McCranie explains, the two authors and strategists' views complement each other. They differ principally in the role and speed in which they see economic warfare playing out in the case of a grand strategic struggle. But they share a view of the importance of the maritime domain and the role that it plays in economics, trade, and national power. This is a fascinating discussion. Let's listen in.
I'm going to be talking about my recent book here, Mahan, Corbett, and the Foundations of Naval Strategic Thought. Before I begin, however, I have to say that a disclaimer of sorts to say that these are my views alone and I'm not representing my employer, the Naval War College or the U.S. Navy, in what I am saying here. I think the best way to start is to perhaps read the first two paragraphs of the book. This is the only reading I will do in the course of the talk, but I think it sets the groundwork here. 3/4 of a century has passed since the last great naval war ended with the surrender of Imperial Japan in 1945. The long era of relative peace on the world's oceans has contributed to globalization and unprecedented economic development. Yet during that time, our institutional understanding of naval power has evaporated. Important knowledge about the purpose of a navy, what a navy can, and perhaps more importantly, what it cannot achieve, has slowly sunk into the abyss. At the turn of the 20th century, a similar situation existed. The final defeat of Napoleon had occurred in 1815. That had ushered in another long period of relative peace on the world's oceans. With the Napoleonic Wars a distant memory, the purpose of naval power appeared at best cloudy. Some even believed their leaders had forgotten how to employ their warships for national political objectives. To remedy this deficiency, commentators and historians at the dawn of the 20th century sought to reacquaint naval and government leaders with the basics of naval power and strategy to instill in them a sense of what was possible in the maritime domain. Though many on both sides of the Atlantic pushed forward theories, two individuals, Alfred Thayer Mahan and Julian Stafford Corbett, today stand head and shoulders above the rest. In 1897, Mahan penned this. This is the year before the Spanish-American War. He wrote, "All ideas about naval warfare at present are more or less imaginative. I say designedly more or less, for some are more and some a little less than imaginative. With wild speculation, there has unquestionably signaled a considerable amount of grave and well-considered thought." This is Mahan talking about what he's seeing in the maritime, the naval domain, in his lifetime as he's trying to grapple with what the next naval conflict will look like, with changes in technology and changes in the international environment. This is the type of world where Mahan and also Corbett worked. Now, Mahan and Corbett were contemporaries. They knew of each other's works. They lived at the same time. Mahan is a little bit of the elder statesman in the two. He starts writing and publishing about a decade before Corbett really digs deeply into his strategic documents. Strangely enough, they live on other sides of the Atlantic. They both speak English, yet they never meet each other. They come very close to crossing paths several times, but it never happens. Corbett's British, upper middle class background. He never serves in the Navy. He's a civilian through and through. He comes to naval history about it midlife and really starts publishing about the time that he's 50. He doesn't have to make money for a living. His family is in real estate in the London area and in international commerce. On the other hand, you have Mahan, Civil War veteran, full career Navy officer, serves close to 40 years altogether. Mahan, toward the end of his career, becomes the first professor, second president of the United States Naval War College. And because of that position, he feels compelled to write a great deal, and this thrust him into the international environment and the world stage. If you look at the two of them sitting side by side, you have Mahan from the United States, Corbett from Britain. They write with very different agendas. Mahan is writing to sell seapower to the American people. The frontier is closing, if not closed. The United States is emerging with the largest economy in the world at the time Mahan starts writing. And he's really asking a question. Should the United States be a continental power, or is the U.S. future in the international environment where he sees the possibilities of wealth through commercial activity are far greater than staying just inside the borders of his own country? And he's trying to sell that, what he calls seapower, to the American people. It is a very seductive message, particularly to the British, because Britain is his example. It's what he puts up on a pedestal as what is the model seapower. The Brits eat it up, largely because they're the model and everything else looks good. Corbett, who is British, realizes he doesn't have to sell seapower to the British people. That has already been done. What he's particularly worried about is another question. He's particularly worried about explaining to British political, military, and naval leaders what is the significance, or how do states operate in the international environment, particularly during wartime. He's really, really concerned with the last naval war ending, major one, ending in 1815. British naval and political leaders really don't have a good, solid foundation of how to employ fleets and what they can achieve in periods of conflict and war. Mahan is most known today for one of the first books he wrote, The Influence of Seapower Upon History. It thrust him onto the world stage, and he will publish a number of things after it, but none of them quite have the gravitas of one of his initial volumes. In some respects, he's always trying to compete to get up there again. Corbett, however, looks at the world, goes in a little bit different route in the publication environment. His most important work is called Some Principles of Maritime Strategy, published in about the middle of his writing career. He writes a number of major studies, particularly historical works, before he delves into a strategic work in Some Principles. Perhaps Churchill said it best about Mahan and Corbett as he writes, the standard work on sea power was written by an American admiral, that's Mahan. The best account of British sea fighting and naval strategy was compiled by an English civilian, Corbett. Let's figure out what these two are about as we look a little bit at some snapshots of several of the chapters here in the book. Chapter 1 is a great place to start. And chapter 1 really lays the foundation for the remainder of the book. The chapter is titled The Ground Strategic Foundations. What happens here is, and Corbett says it very well, where great empires are concerned, wars cannot be concluded upon the sea. Rather, such wars require the order combination of naval, diplomatic, and land force. What Corbett is getting at, and it's something that Mahan understood as well, except in the rarest of cases, wars and the major events of the world happen on land. It's where people live, or at least the majority of people live. It's where leaders have their governments. Wars are generally fought over who controls a piece of territory, who rules a state, Very rarely is a war fought entirely in the maritime domain at sea. It happens, but you have to look hard for it. The Anglo-Dutch wars of the 17th century are one of the few that really come to mind. This is a problem. I'm going to talk here about naval strategy and about the use of naval power here for the next 30 minutes or so. And the thing about it is both Corbett and Mahan realize that you have to figure out how to translate what goes on at sea into political effects on land. You've got to figure out how to cross domains. And to figure out how to cross domains is complicated and requires a great deal of nuance in their theory and makes them have to raise their theories up to the grand strategic level because they just can't look at naval strategy. They've got to look at how naval strategy interplays with other instruments of power to be able to cross that domain and to get the strategic effects. Mahan comes up with his idea of sea power, and if there's any term that is synonymous with Mahan, it's those two words, sea power. And he always uses sea power as two words, not one word in Mahan's writings. He's writing about their ancient Athens, but he says her great navy and her commercial wealth, in other words, her sea power. Sea power for Mahan is a combination of economic and naval elements and their symbiotic relationship, how they work together, how they function in combination. Now, Mahan's going to make an argument that most states, frankly, cannot be sea powers. They just don't have the prerequisites. They don't have the infrastructure, the underlying geography that is allowed to make it happen. They don't necessarily have the right type of, or the right mindset, should I say, among their people. You need to have risk-taking business people. You've got to have people who are willing to go to sea in large numbers. You have to have a government that is willing to foster sea power. And again, it also comes back to geography. Certain states' geography pushes people to the sea. Other states' geography pulls people back away from the sea. So he comes up with 6 elements of sea power. You'll find those in the opening pages of The Influence of Sea Power Upon History, which really clearly outlines Mahan's grand strategic perspective. Compared with most of Mahan's writings, it is relatively clear and straightforward. Corbett says, sea power, I get it. But it's not enough. It's not everything. Corbett is looking at a little bit different question. He's trying to figure out how to operate in the international environment, particularly in a conflict. And he comes up with an idea. He calls it major strategy most often, but sometimes he also calls it grand strategy. In fact, he grapples with a term for it. And for him, major strategy is the whole resources of a nation. This is the naval force, the land force, its diplomatic activities, its commercial and its financial position. And Corbett says this is a branch of statesmanship. The statesman has to figure out, the political leader has to figure out how the whole resources of a nation work together. Now, this does not excuse the admiral, it does not excuse the general, because they have to figure out how they are an element within a larger whole. But for Corbett, he's trying to figure out it's just not a question about naval power. It's a question about how the various instruments of power interact so you can get actually get force multipliers out of that instead of looking at the world just from a single instrument of power. Chapter 2 was the hardest thing I've ever written in my entire life. And if you read my book, you may see it's the hardest thing here. Why do I say it's the hardest thing? This is not about a question of specifics. It's trying to dig into the minds of Corbett and Mahan to try and figure out how they looked at problems, how they did their problem solving, how they created their theoretical outlook, how they balanced certain things. Corbett writes, and this is something I believe he sincerely believes is the main binding link that unifies world history, is the sea. The general historian then cannot afford to neglect it. This is the most important part of it here. Sometimes to view a European situation from the quarterdeck of a flagship at sea is a little short of a revelation. Corbett is somebody who has a deep appreciation for history, and particularly looks at history from a maritime perspective. He starts out his historical approach from being a naval historian to being a historian of the maritime world, and he never quite loses that lens. Mahan also has a firm belief in the importance of history to provide examples and to provide evidence to understand, to help us understand today's international environment. However, the two of them have some differences in how they approach theoretical issues. Mahan is a big picture guy. Mahan comes up with the idea of seapower before he'd read a lot of history. To him, it just kind of jumped off of the page to him and said, wow, I can't believe nobody has seen it before. He's like one of these people, I know you've seen the ones out there, you're going, this person has stated the complete obvious in some respects, but he becomes famous for stating the obvious. You just have to figure out that obvious thing you can become famous for. Now, he's big picture oriented. Now, the thing about it is he's going to do a lot of research later on. He's going to study history, and he's going to find the historical studies largely back up his initial approach. He is a deductive thinker. He's coming up with an idea, and then he figures out ways to test his hypothesis. Corbett is the exact opposite. Corbett spends the 1890s in the archives and reading, refusing to put things down on paper until he's absolutely sure that he's got the right answer. He spends a decade writing major historical studies before he writes his major strategic work, Some Principles of Maritime Strategy. He is very much of an inductive thinker. He is going to find the mass of historical examples and see where the preponderance of the information goes before he draws the conclusions for himself. In some respects, Mahan is the prototype of a political scientist in the modern world, and in some respects, Corbett is the prototype of the historian, both of whom have turned into a strategist at this point. They just come at the world in a little bit different ways. Mahan, when he's writing, is very happy to take theories of land warfare and where he sees they're applicable, apply them to the maritime domain. One of the reasons he does this is there is not a lot of naval strategic writing out there in the early 1890s when he publishes his first few books. By the time Corbett is publishing 12 or so years later, a lot has been written, including Mahan's works, and he doesn't necessarily have to do this. In fact, what Corbett is going to do is he's going to use land warfare as a point of departure. And what I mean by this is Corbett has almost a man crush on Clausewitz. Read Some Principles, you'll see it shine through. He's brilliant, he's whatnot. But the thing about it is Corbett is very selective at what he picks from Clausewitz. He doesn't talk about what Clausewitz writes about in terms of offense, defense, how warfare happens on land. What he's trying to figure out is things like the purpose of theory, critical analysis, war is a continuation of politics by other means, the real underlying foundations of Clausewitz's ideas. I'm not going to walk you through chapters 4 to 10. 4 to 10 are a whole series of chapters that deal with aspects of naval strategy that puts Mahan and Corbett in comparison with each other. There's a lot of overlap in chapters 4 to 10. And what I mean by overlap is Mahan and Corbett oftentimes come to the same conclusions. They oftentimes take very different routes to get to those conclusions. Their roadmaps look like they're going in opposite directions, but somehow they come together in the end. More often than not, they agree in the area, particularly on naval strategy. In areas about commerce, sea lines of communication, and what they call command of the sea, or those type of things, Mahan and Corbett have very, very little disagreement that comes between them. In fact, in most of the things on the list, their disagreement is much more of nuance and the fact that Corbett writes second. And when you have a choice, you've got two options. You can write first or second. Both of them have advantages to it. If you write first, you've got nobody to compare yourself to, so nobody can chastise you for being wrong, but you have to break new ground all the way through. If you write second, like Corbett does, you definitely can build off of the people that came on before, so you can actually dig deeper into the subject, but you're always seeming to have to compare yourself back to the original. And so Corbett tends to be more nuanced and go deeper into the subjects, in part because it's easier for him, because there's a lot more out there about it. Chapters 12 and 13 are really the heart of the book. So for those of you who are thinking, wow, all I have to do is read chapters 12 and 13 and we've got it. Well done. It's okay. I was a student too. But chapter 12 is about Mahan. Chapter 13 is about Corbett. And these are what I call their ways of war. And when I'm talking about a way of war, I'm looking at their theory. I'm looking at the actor they're writing about, the instruments of national power they emphasize, the type of challenge which they are attempting to meet with their theories, and how that comes together, and how their theories create not just a series of disparate ideas out there, but they are writing something that is a coherent whole. Both of them are writing to send a message to the people of the United States in the case of Mahan, to British government leaders in the case of Corbett, and they're telling an overall story. Mahan's story starts in peacetime. Mahan's story starts with Seapower. And Seapower has a number of elements to it. Some of them are geographic. Some of them deal with the people and commercial activity, while others deal with government. All these factors come together to indicate if a state can be a sea power. Now, according to Seapower, what I said earlier, Seapower includes both commercial, should I say economic, and naval aspects to it. Let's talk about the economic aspect to it. And this is peacetime. This is not wartime. Mahan is not a warmonger, although some people have claimed that he is. In fact, Mahan really prefers peacetime because he sees that in peacetime you can make more money. In peacetime, there's a greater opportunity for financial gain and to build sea power. Wartime has risk to it, and he would rather want to avoid those risks. But in terms of his economic issue, what he says is, in terms of economics, maritime trade is critical. And maritime trade works in to help the business people, to help the people of a country. It provides wealth. That wealth can turn into taxes. The taxes then go into the government, so the government can input more funds to make sea power stronger. What you see here is a pair of virtuous circles that are running and strengthening the country every single cycle that it goes through. However, sea power also has a naval side to it. And one part of the naval side is good order at sea. It keeps piracy down, it keeps lawlessness at bay, it allows for the peaceful movement of commerce and productivity across the oceans. Now, the more money that gets pumped into the government, the better its navy is, which means the better the security for commerce is. And again, you actually have a larger virtuous circle that is working there as well. All of this stuff is building the sea power stronger. The thing that Mahan sees is the sea powers are the rich countries, and they keep adding to that wealth. Now, occasionally, sometimes, good order at sea and just the normal security for commerce is not enough. Sometimes you need to use the Navy for diplomatic or deterrent purposes. Navies are great for that because they can show up off the coast, they can leave, they can wave the flag, they look ominous, you can project force at a distance, and if it's successful, you get greater security for commerce. If it's unsuccessful, then you've got a major off-ramp that goes toward war. Mahan believes that sea power in the peacetime is fantastic, and he wishes to keep it going, but he's also a realist enough to know that sometimes you cannot stop war. And if you cannot stop war, you need to have as prepared a naval force, and the wealth generated by the sea power is capable of building up the Navy to be prepared. Now, if you're prepared, the decision for war comes along, and he's got basically two types of wars that he thinks about. One is wars that can be solved in a battle or are more likely a campaign. Those are wars where the defeated power places low value of the object. Think the Spanish-American War for a second. There is never a question in this war that American armies are marching to Madrid to overthrow the Spanish government. The war remains in the colonies, and it happens, or Spain's colonies, and it happens over a very short period of time. The Spanish give up. A battle or a campaign does it, and usually ends in this case with some sort of negotiated settlement. But that's not the case in all cases. The Napoleonic Wars, Mahan dies in the opening months of the First World War, but the First World War also plays out into this other type, where the sea power has to gain control of the sea, carry out protracted economic warfare to grind down and exhaust the opponent, which sea powers Mahan believes can do, and to then yield successful war termination. If you take that point there, this builds it out a little bit more fully. Control of the sea is critical, and everything spins out of control of the sea for Mahan. But what he feels is the primary line of effort, and it's very much in keeping with the sea power ideas. That primary line of effort is in terms of economic warfare. To him, he's a true believer that you can defeat an opponent by wearing them down economically. It's a protracted, long, and grinding struggle, but a struggle that works. He also says the army of a sea power and coalition partners of the sea power are important, but to him, those are secondary lines of effort. The decisive point, the thing that really matters in his mind is the economic side. Corbett sees the world in a little bit different way. Corbett is trying to figure out a way to accelerate. He's trying to avoid what sea powers do to fight long, protracted economic struggles. His theory is designed in some respects to speed the process up. If you look at, and in fact we can go back here, if you look at this half of the slide, and that's what you're seeing right here, he and Mahan really don't disagree a great deal. Corbett is looking at a virtuous circle also, where the economic strength of the maritime state is able to build funds, build wealth to finance a naval strategy, which is then able to, what he calls exercise command of the sea, or to use the command of the sea to better control the sea lines of communication and then to better build an economic strategy. The big difference between Corbett and Mahan is this. Corbett sees economic warfare as a way to weaken an opponent, not the primary main way to win for a maritime state. He sees it as just too long and protracted. There's a picture of the virtuous circle. Again, weakening the opponent. I do want to call your attention to naval strategy because really that's the heart of what Corbett writes about. He's a naval historian. He works for the Royal Navy. He understands the Navy as Britain's most powerful and flexible instrument of national power. His views on naval strategy, particularly about obtaining command of the sea and the use of the sea lines of communication, have a lot of parallels with Mahan. The differences are largely a result of how one is a Brit writing for Britain, the other one writing for the United States. Exercising command of the sea right here, or using command of the sea, is something that Corbett writes about a lot more than Mahan. And it's central. One thing you should notice is there is no line coming off of naval strategy toward defeating the opponent. Instead, naval strategy is the enabler. Naval strategy allows you to control the sea lines of communication, to weaken an opponent economically. It allows one to send expeditionary forces overseas to carry out military operations. It even helps with diplomatic activity. To Corbett, the real primary ways that the maritime state needs to think about winning is using land and diplomatic strategy for more decisive outcomes. Mahan puts those as secondary. Corbett pushes them more as primary. We're basically at the end of my talk here. And what we've talked about, or what I've talked about, is about Mahan, Corbett, their theories, how they come at things. Both of them wrote in a highly competitive international environment at the turn of the 20th century. Both of them are writing about challenges that they are dealing with. For Corbett, his challenge is the rise of Imperial Germany and how Britain is to confront that. And as Mahan is writing, he's asking whether the Americans should be a sea power, and then, because they should be a sea power, how they should act in the international environment because of this. And with that, I thank you for your attention.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Horns of a Dilemma, and please don't forget to visit our website at tnsr.org.